Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell just said he has the votes to move forward without a compromise with Democrats on witnesses.
We have the votes once the impeachment trial has begun to pass a resolution essentially the same, very similar to the 100-0 vote in the Clinton trial, which sets up, as you may recall, what could best be described as maybe a phase one. At that point, during the Clinton trial, the issue of the appropriateness of calling witnesses was addressed. Obviously, that is the most contentious part of one of these proceedings, and that'll be addressed at that time and not before the trial begins.
Joining me now is Connecticut Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal, a member of the Judiciary and Armed Services Committees. It's good to see you, Senator. This is something that he has suggested before, Mitch McConnell, that the trial would start, and then and only then would a decision be made about witnesses. But this time it comes after John Bolton, of course, a critical witness, somebody as close to the president in these actions as anyone, and someone who took copious notes at the time, in real time, has said he would be willing to answer a subpoena from the Senate. What's your reaction to McConnell's comments?
Mitch McConnell is simply making good on his promise to Donald Trump that he will put Trump in charge of his own trial, the defendant in charge of this proceeding, which makes it very far from the full, fair proceeding that the Constitution requires and the American people deserve. In effect, my Republican colleagues say they lack enough information, but they are taking steps to prevent that information, like John Bolton's testimony, from being presented. And there is a real falsity at the core of Mitch McConnell's strategy. He likens it to the Clinton trial. In fact, it's very different from the Clinton trial, where there was already witness testimony before the special counsel and the grand jury before the beginning of the trial, and at the beginning of the trial, documents were available to the United States Senate. Here, the President of the United States has gagged witnesses, and he has blocked documents. Not a single document sought by the House of Representatives in its impeachment consideration was provided by the President. So my Republican colleagues are going to be haunted by history, because we are going to force votes. We are going to make them vote on these witnesses and these documents, not only at the beginning of the trial when Mitch McConnell offers that resolution, but also at the end of the trial, so-called the second phase. They're going to be on record, and voters are going to haunt them in November, just as history will haunt them.
In the meantime, Senator Adam Schiff says that a House subpoena for John Bolton he doesn't think is off the table. So do you think, if it looks as though, and it does look as though, Mitch McConnell is absolutely not going to commit to any kinds of witnesses, to subpoenaing John Bolton, should the House continue to hold the articles of impeachment and potentially issue a subpoena to John Bolton, although he has only said he would say yes to a Senate subpoena?
As Adam Schiff said this morning, the decision on when to send the articles of impeachment to the Senate is really Nancy Pelosi's to make. But the John Bolton testimony really has to be before the Senate or the House. Remember, he's writing a book. He didn't need a subpoena to tell the American people in a book about these issues, nor should he need one from the Senate. And so I believe that either the House or the Senate should compel his testimony, and he should, in fact, volunteer without a subpoena. But the simple fact here is that the American people overwhelmingly, 70%, even Republicans by 60%, believe in a full, fair proceeding with witnesses and documents. And Mitch McConnell is simply defying the Constitution and the will of the United States people.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.